Chapter 5 The Consolamentum. The Cathar Sacrament. The Consolamentum is the only Cathar sacrament. It is generally defined as spiritual baptism because the gospel passage on which it is based calls it baptism, in which it is said that Jesus will baptize in Holy Spirit and in fire. It is practiced through the laying on of hands. This gesture is often performed by Jesus, as the Gospels attest, but only for the purpose of healing, while in the Acts of the Apostles the Holy Spirit is conferred by it. In no case, however, is it called baptism. The name Consolamentum, Consolament in Occitan, and Consolazione in Italian, derives from the attribution of consolation given by the Holy Spirit. Nonetheless, the definition of baptism was in many ways a radically different sacrament to Catholic baptism. It wasn't carried out using water. It was only performed on adult persons. It didn't have the function of a remission of original sin. It wasn't performed on all the members of the community, but only on a small minority. If one really wanted to find a counterpart among the sacraments of the Catholic Church, more than baptism or confirmation, to which, page 176, it was compared, it will correspond to ordination, also because whoever received it acquired the power to transmit it to others. Such comparison, though, isn't right, because the picture of the consolato is very different from that of the priest. In church history, from an initial equality between the members of the Christian community, there developed a growing differentiation between the priests and laity, or faithful, so much so that in medieval society, the ones who pray now constituted a privileged caste and separate from the ones who work. Even in this aspect, the Cathars had maintained the original structure. In fact, while the Catholic ones who pray lived at the expense of the ones who work, the Cathar Consolati, following the usage of the original communities, worked and lived by their own labour. Whoever received the Consolamentum acquired, be they men or women, the power to transmit it to others, because the Cathars believed that the differences between men and women concerned only their bodies, not their souls. The women could also preach. Never before Catharism could a woman express herself with equal liberty. To tell the truth, not even after, in any of the various Protestant churches, who were also, and still are, considerably more open to women in a way the Catholic Church cannot be. At the time, the fact that women could preach and administer sacraments could represent an insupportable scandal. Perhaps it's not a coincidence that, the trials of the Cathars exhausted, the Inquisition will start the witch hunts. Receiving the Consolamentum carries a drastic change of life. In practice, it meant no sexual relations, strictly vegetarian food, because the ban on killing was even extended to animals, the obligation not to kill, not even in legitimate defense, to never lie, to never swear, the obligation to work at a job. The consolati often came from aristocratic families and wouldn't have need to work, and a series of fasts and prayers to be performed at specific hours of the day and night. All prescriptions were scrupulously observed on pain of the invalidation of the received Consolamentum. The possibility of the consolati falling into sin represented one of the most serious problems that affected Catharism, page 177, from within, because if that happened, it didn't nullify only the sacrament received from him or from her, but also those administered by him or her. Since the earliest days of Christianity, the invalidity of the sacrament, in the case that the priest was unworthy, was one of the most debated issues, and at the time it was upheld not only by the Cathars, but from many of the numerous heretical movements, finding large consensus giving the widespread malpractice of the clergy at that time. The underlying discourse is based on the conviction that the presence of the Holy Spirit makes sin impossible. As a consequence, if a consolato sinned, It was evident that the Holy Spirit was not in him or her, and so couldn't have been transmitted to others. Therefore, the sacraments administered by that person automatically lost their validity, and all those who had received the consolamentum from him or her had to repeat the rite. As you can easily guess, this created serious problems, but it was a very rare occurrence. All the sources, including the most hostile, agree in reporting the absolute observance of the rules by the Cathar Consolati and praise their exemplary way of life. Considering the hardness of the life of the Consolato, the rigour with which it was tackled, and the danger posed by persecution, one understands why the consolamentum was imparted not when a person was an adult, but more often at an advanced age. Contrary to the Catholic Church, that even today accepts pre-adolescent children into the seminaries, the Cathar novice had to be at least 18 or 24 years old. The sources aren't in agreement about the minimum age, but they are in asserting that it was rare for a young person to aspire to receive the consolamentum. It was often a case of widowers and widows. If any were still married, they could certainly receive it, and didn't need to disown their partners for this, as has been said too often. They must, though, undertake to live beside them in absolute chastity, as brothers or sisters, the sources say. Or they could live in the so-called Cathar houses, quite widespread before the persecution, and about which we will talk more later. Receiving the consolamentum didn't mean undertaking an ecclesiastical career. The consolamentum was the crowning of a spiritual journey that all could accomplish. Page 178. Regarding the ritual, the consolamentum was structured in two distinct moments and separate in time. After a long period of initiation, a true and real novitiate that lasted almost a year, came the first rite, the transmission of the book, the Bible and the Gospels, and the transmission of the prayer, that is, the Our Father, the only prayer taught by Jesus Christ that was so sacred to the Cathars that it could only be recited by those who had received the consolamentum or those on their way to receive it. Their Our Father was practically the same as the Catholic one, except for some small differences, of which the most significant is that the Cathars did not say panis quotidianus, but rather panem supersubstantialem. This expression was believed to be heretical because it was recited by the Cathars, but not because it corresponds to the text of the Our Father in the Latin version of the Gospel of Matthew, while the Catholic version is taken from the Gospel of Luke. So not only is it not heretical, but is even more authentic, given that Matthew was one of the apostles, while Luke wasn't. In the Italian translation, this difference was suppressed, and in both Gospels appears the Catholic term daily bread. No other Catholic prayer, Ave Maria, the Apostles' Creed, was recited by the Cathars, and as it happens, no other Catholic prayer is present in the Divine Comedy. The Our Father is quoted in full in a poetic version of extraordinary beauty. I'll say right away that the bread is called there daily manna. Certainly Dante could not write supersubstantial. We ask ourselves, however, why did the Cathars reject the term daily, and what does supersubstantial mean? The answer is all too obvious. By asking for daily bread, people mean that which we feed ourselves, necessary to live, material bread. The supersubstantial instead is unequivocally heavenly bread. As the critics have also noticed, substituting manna for bread gave that bread right away the meaning of spiritual food. With the transmission of the book and the prayer, the final stage of the rite was concluded. After a further period of preparation and purification, in which the novice must already be complying with all the rules of life expected for consolati, but could not transmit the sacrament yet, He or she received a true and real consolamentum that consisted of the infusion of the Holy Spirit through the laying on of the hands by older or more authoritative consolati, possibly a bishop, or even by more consolati. It consisted of a solemn ceremony, quite complicated, that took place in the presence of all the consolati of that church, and also non-consolati believers. Obviously this could happen only before the persecution. Then prudence demanded a simpler rite. The same applied to dress. The consolati wore habits of black or dark blue, at least in safer times, and wore beards and long hair. Later, they needed to avoid being recognized.